Okay, good evening, everybody. And I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you this evening to this keynote, or indeed co-note seminar for the 31st Irish Environmental Researchers Colloquium, entitled Can Ireland Thrive Within the Doughnut? My name is Gerard Mullally from the Department of Sociology and Criminology in UCC, and I'll be the chair this evening. The seminar this evening is hosted by the Environmental Research Institute at UCC in collaboration with the Environmental Sciences Association of Ireland. It's also part of the regular Greening Our City webinar series held by Cork Chamber of Commerce, Cork Healthy Cities, Green Spaces for Health, SHEP Earth Aware, and Cork Environmental Forum. We'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Cork City Council for the generous sponsorship of this evening's event. We're delighted to welcome our two speakers this evening, Kate Rayworth and Roisin Markham, who will be passing back and forth to discuss and reflect on the question, can Ireland thrive within the Doughnut? Before I introduce Kate and Roisin more formally, just some housekeeping, I suppose. We're very pleased to have the graphic artist Emer McNally working in the background during Kate and Roisin's talk to do a graphic harvest. And the results of that will be displayed in the final Q&A session. You're encouraged to use the question and answers function to address questions directly to our speakers. But you can also introduce yourself as well using the chat function or make comments in the chat function. Both our speakers regard this as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end. So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce our speakers. First of all, Kate Rayworth is an economist that's very much focused on making economics fit for the 21st century. Her book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, is an international bestseller that's been translated now into 20 languages. It's been longlisted for 2017 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award. Kate is co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL, and works with cities, businesses, communities, governments, and educators to turn Doughnut economics from a radical idea into transformative action. She teaches at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute and is Professor of Practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Roisin Markham is the founder and the network steward of the Irish Doughnut Economics Network. She's a cultural thinker living with the question, how do we create a future worth living into? She's Director of Innovation Services at BDT Consultancy and works in design strategy, service design, and emergent systems change. She's a visiting lecturer on design thinking and rapid prototyping for the Cairn School of Business and Economics in the National University of Ireland, Galway. Roisin lives with her family and 2 dogs near Cahors in Wexford, and she's a steward to 9 Oaks and creating a forest garden. So without any more ado, can I ask Kate to begin the presentation. So thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you so much, Joe. And it's a huge pleasure to be here this evening and indeed to be doing a co-note with Roisin. So I'm going to share my screen to kick off some questions to share this evening. Can Ireland thrive within the Doughnut? That is a matter for you to ask. I'm just here to ask the question. It's a matter for you to answer, right? I'm here just to answer the question. So I want to start with the economics of the 20th century, which underpins so much of the way we've been taught to think, whether we studied economics or not. In so many lectures around the world, and still today, ask students, and the first diagram they remember learning is the supply and demand of the market, which puts the market at the center of our vision. It makes price the metric of concern, and it by definition means that anything that's left outside the price contract is called an externality. And we find ourselves in the absurd situation of talking about the impending death of much of the living world as an environmental externality. To me, that is reason enough to stop using this frame. The selfie of humanity is, of course, rational economic man. You can see him standing here. I depicted him as a man standing alone with no dependents. He's got money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. The real problem with this character is that the more that students are told that he is like us, they and we all actually become more like him. We begin to take on his traits because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. We need a far richer picture of humanity if 10 billion of us are to thrive here together on this living planet. And then the goal. The diagram of the goal of the economy is never actually drawn in the textbooks because it doesn't need to be. It underpins every political speech, almost every macroeconomics lecture and economic journalism. It is the goal of endless growth, marked up in GDP, with the absurdity that no matter how rich a nation already is, like the one I'm in the UK, and indeed yours, that people think that the politicians and economists think the solution to our nation's problems lies in yet more growth, even though we live in nations that are richer than any nations ever have been before us. There is an absurdity to this. And I believe this pursuit and belief that endless expansion and growth is the solution and is progress has led us into many of the crises we face today. Financial meltdown of 2008 emerged from a financial system that aims to endlessly expand. The climate and ecological breakdown that we face emerges from humanity's endlessly growing use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources until we realized what we were doing. COVID crisis from humanity endlessly extending into wildlife areas, coupled with ever-growing travel between nations by flight, we create perfect conditions for a global health pandemic. So I believe we need to transform our vision of the shape of progress, and it's not endless growth. And for this, I give you an alternative. It is the donut, the only one that actually turns out to be any good for us. So you don't need to eat donuts, just they're conceptual. These are the best ones. If you want to understand this concept, think of it as a compass for humanity's 21st century prosperity. Think of our use of Earth's resources radiating out from the middle of that picture. So the hole in the middle is a place where people are falling short on the essentials of life, where people don't have the food and water, healthcare, housing, political voice, income, equality that every person has a claim to. I can say that because this center is crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals. So all the world's governments have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim not to live in the hole in the donut. But as we bring humanity out of that hole, of course, we use Earth's resources, and when we use them in such ways that we begin to put pressure on the ecological ceiling, there we threaten the life support systems of planet Earth. We threaten climate breakdown. We acidify the oceans and create a hole in the ozone layer. We use too much fertilizer, convert too much of Earth's surface for human use, withdraw too much water. We break down the web of life. These are the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system scientists just over a decade ago. So this is very new in Western mindsets. This is very new. Put those two together. And the goal of the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. Sounds so simple. And if only we could gear our economies towards that goal. Indeed, I believe it is time that we must. And it's already transformed the shape of progress. It's no longer endless expansion. It's thriving in a dynamic balance. But if that's where we want to be, we are very far from that right now, as all of the red in this picture shows. This is a global donut. So that's the extent to which humanity is falling short on the essentials. Food goes 11% of the way to the center of the circle, that red wedge, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. But you can see it's true on every one of these social dimensions. And we are already in significant, dangerous ecological overshoot. So I call this humanity's collective selfie. This is our portrait of ourselves and the living world today. And it's our generational challenge. We happen to be the generation on watch. We happen to be the generation of adults who are policymakers, journalists, business leaders, community activists, teachers, lecturers, students. What are we going to do? Are we going to be the ones who start to turn this story around? I profoundly believe this is what our children's children will ask us. What did you do once that you knew? Now, this is the global story, but of course, most transformation and action doesn't happen at the global scale. A lot of it happens locally. So let's scale down to 4 nations donuts. We've got Malawi at one end, a lot of human deprivation without overshooting its pressure on the planet on around $1,000 per person per year. China, double whammy of overshoot and shortfall. Ireland, some shortfall, and massive overshoot. And then Norway, a country that's often at the top of the Human Development Index. Congratulations, Norway, you're the most human development achieved country in the world. But look at that ecological overshoot. How can we praise countries while ignoring their massive pressure on the planet? And of course, this goes for every high income nation across Europe, across the Americas, Canada, Australia, Japan, all in overshoot. Putting these countries together, 150, you can see that every nation needs to transform. We need to move towards the donut for the first time. And that's never been done before by any nation in the world, whether low, middle, or high income. So this is a time for unprecedented humility, coupled with unprecedented ambition. And let's recognize that though these countries stand as separate dots on the page, their histories and futures are deeply intertwined through colonialism and military power, through trade and finance rules, through ongoing resource extraction, through the current and future impacts of climate change. So we need transformation within and between nations. How are we going to get there? I believe we need to start economics again. Don't bring me supply and demand. Let's start here. The big picture of the embedded economy. The economy is a subset of society. It is a social construct embedded in the living world, drawing on Earth's materials, putting out waste and pollution, bathed in a river of solar energy. We must begin economics here and create economies that are compatible with being social and ecological constructs. But dive inside, and the economy, yes, there's the markets, and mainstream economics tells us, oh, we are consumer or producer, and you may be a worker earning a wage or an owner earning rent and profit. But that's not all we are in the economy. We're not just consumers and producers. We are, in relation to the state, we may be public servant and resident, voter and protester, all crucial roles that we can play. This is what shows up in GDP. And of course, it misses the household, where we are parent, partner, relative, and child, of unpaid caring work, traditionally performed by women, essential to everyone's well-being. And then the commons, where we come together to co-create value as volunteers, share as co-creators and stewards. And I believe we need to create economies that enable us to thrive in all of these economic roles. COVID has shown us that when the market space is literally shut down due to the need for physical distancing, that is when the state steps in and we all become aware of whose work is essential work. But we also depend massively more on caring work, whether it's for the sick, whether homeschooling children, looking out for our neighbors, but also the community of food banks, of common solidarity. And the one thing people say they don't want to lose after the COVID crisis is that bigger sense of a we of humanity, because we are, of course, the most social of all mammals, and we need to tap into that and nurture the best of human nature. How are we going to get into this donut? We are in shortfall and overshoot. To me, this is a sign that we have a deeply degenerative economy. We're running down the living world, and it's deeply divisive. Billions falling short, others causing massive overshoot. We need to transform the underlying dynamics of our economies. So we've inherited degenerative industrial structures where we take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while, and throw it away. And we need to transform that dynamic so that we are using resources again and again, far more carefully, creatively, more collectively, and more slowly. A circular or cyclical economy where resources are separated, the organic, biological nutrients and the synthetic human-made materials, and that we mimic nature's process so that we refurbish, reuse, recreate, regenerate, repair. Some examples of regenerative design in practice: from car-free city centre in Oslo, getting fossil fuels, because the energy of the circular economy must be renewable energy, getting fossil fuel transport out of the city centre. Amsterdam has brought in stringent circular economy regulations, including in the sector of construction. This is from an experimental district in the city where all construction must be circular by design. So materials carry a passport, how they've been used and how they can be reused. But also ecological regeneration, whether a city recognizes that it's prone to flooding and so therefore should become a sponge city, able to absorb that water, as in here in Kunming in China, or in Medellin, where the river used to be treated as a handy industrial sewer. And they realized that if the city was to belong in its ecosystem, the river is life. And they brought parks and humanity back to reconnect with the ecosystem of place. So we need to become regenerative by design, but also we've inherited structures that can be deeply divisive, capturing value and opportunity in the hands of a few. And we need to transform our economies so that they are distributive, so that value and opportunity are shared far more equitably with everybody who co-creates that. And that turns out to be the whole of society. Some examples of distributive design in practice, again, bringing it to cities. Preston in the UK. Personally, I think Preston is one of the UK's best exports at the moment. The innovation that's happening there in a city that had no external investment coming in to rescue it, they realized we need to use our own budgets, our procurement of the city administration, schools, hospitals, museums, universities. Let's buy locally, let's reboot our economy here. Vienna, more than 60% of people live in social housing owned by the city or by city-run cooperatives, because Vienna decided that housing is a human right. It's not an investment luxury opportunity. In Stockton in California, a universal basic income experiment to see what happens if you give a guaranteed income to the poorest in society, and the results came out in recent months. It's been very strong. People can get out of unemployment. They can get into long-term employment more significantly than those who don't have such access. And then creating physically distributed public space. Why hand over public space to car parking? Why not create pocket parks, as in here in Bogota, where people can meet and connect and become a community? So we've moved from the 20th century starting point to a much richer 21st century starting point, where we recognize the economy is in society, that humanity is a collective, and that we need to get into the donut. We need to become regenerative by design and distributive by design. So far, I've shared some of the fundamental ideas of donut economics. And when my book came out in 2017, I was amazed by the number of people who came up to me after a talk and said, no, but I actually want to do this. I'm teaching this in my classroom. I'm taking this to the next town councillors meeting. I'm taking this into the board of my company. I'm taking this to my community group. It's the change makers who want to take these ideas off the page and turn them into action that really motivate and excite me. And that's why I wanted to make today a co-note with Roisin Markham, who's going to tell us now about the work she's done in bringing these ideas to Ireland.
Hey, I'm just sharing my screen. Thanks, Kate. So Kate and her brilliant co-founder launched the Doughnut Economics Action Lab last year, late August into September. And that has really allowed a group of global change makers to get into action. So it began as a conversation. I noticed that somebody else from Ireland had joined the Deal website. And I don't know about you, but when I'm interested in something and I'm curious about something, I reach out to somebody and I say to them, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's go for a cuppa or a pint in the old days, right? Now it's a Zoom meeting or a phone call, but here we are. So we started very small with a group of us, and I've been mapping the conversation. And now Iden is a network that's spanned across Ireland. And it's quite interesting to see how it's populated all around the peripheral edge, as Ireland was once inhabited itself. So the network connects with each other through the Doughnut Economics Action Lab Code of Conduct and Principles of Practice. We ask everybody to join Deal as a member because that protects us and keeps us all safe online and in the spaces we're trying to work in. It also helps build that global donut movement and helps us share ideas and actions and tools so that we're both learning and generating the learning and sharing. And that's an important practicing principle for the Irish Doughnut Economic Network. Learn and share knowledge about transformative action through the model of Doughnut economics. We're also really interested in a healthy discourse and to hear different voices around new ideas for the 21st century economics in Ireland. And the space is made for voices that don't normally get included in those conversations. The network itself is from a broad range of people across Ireland living in Ireland. And often I find myself in a Zoom call with people from several different nationalities and backgrounds who've chosen to live in Ireland and aren't just here by the accident of their birth. And I love that. We need more of that. So we support ourselves and each other around the aim of meeting the needs of all the people within the means of the living planet. And ultimately, what Iden is about is bringing the donut local in an Irish context to a town, village, city, and place. Locally, placemaking, where you work or where your organization is, where we all live, work, play, and learn. And that's pretty key. So it all started with a virtual cuppa. And once I started the virtual cuppa, then we saw other places around the globe asking me how to do that. So I was delighted to support places like London get into action and California, give them information about how to get into action. And we basically ran a weekly cuppa session from September to December, which was an open invitation to whoever was curious, interested, or wanted to know more about donut economics. And what happened was, I did this rather awful mapping of our knowledge within some of the early cuppas. And we discovered that we had all different knowledge about what we understood around donut economics, and we were curious and wanted to learn more. So brilliantly, we started a book club, which was one of the key ideas in the book club came from Celine Horner, which is a member of this colloquium and is here, I hope, today. Say hi, Celine. And herself and two other members of IDEN basically came up with this idea that we'd have 3 volunteers that would each read a chapter a week and then share their insights and what it meant to them, the chapters. And that led to phenomenal insights and discussion. And it was an open international book club. So that really informed us. And some of us kept going with trying to understand. So the virtual cuppa changed and shifted into 2021. We moved the cuppa to a monthly session in the evening every second Tuesday, and that was to accommodate people who were at work and couldn't make it to the Friday morning sessions. We continue to build a Slack channel. We have tried a couple of different distributed and decentralized applications to build the community outside of the big 4 technology companies. Some of those worked and some of those didn't, but at the moment we're using Slack to help build the network, and people are welcome to join us there. So we follow the Deal Code of Conduct and Practice, we keep people safe online, and we offer a really friendly and collective group to have an interesting conversation and to get into action. And we've started West Cork Doughnut Economic Network is Ireland's first doughnut that have been in action since the first lockdown in 2020. So Ireland has doughnut action, right? President Higgins has come out and said, great stuff, Kate, you rock, let's do it. And he's backed the doughnut. So why aren't we seeing more action on it, right? We have Codema using the doughnut in their presentations. We have FASTA using the doughnut in their theory of change, which is fantastic. We've got the Dublin Food Co-op having conversations with UCC's Dr. Carol Power on the doughnut economics for co-ops. We have a restaurant, a cafe in Dublin, using doughnut economics as a philosophy for standing up their business and applying it. But what does Ireland's doughnut look like? What do you see when you look at this picture? What has Ireland got in great abundance? We have nature. These are all wild grasses, natural native trees and flowers from just around where I live in Wexford, in North Wexford. And I don't know if this is what Ireland's doughnut looks like. I don't know if we'll end up calling it Amniocht le Céile. But I think it's interesting. So Ireland's doughnut is written in Ohm on the right-hand side as a nod to our past, but I'm excited as to where we're going to bring it to all of our futures. So what is Ireland's reality? Sorry, just messing with my slides now. Ireland's social foundation looks really good, right? But we have some issues. Equality and sanitation. We're losing people inside of the doughnut, right? How will we talk to people who are falling short of the doughnut about doughnut economics? How do we hold them in our society? COVID has highlighted that to us hugely. This is a small selection across Ireland's national media and through social media of where Ireland is failing in the social foundation. It's not just life satisfaction and employment and equality and sanitation. We have major crises in housing, in homelessness, in looking after our health, in direct provision, and we have an oncoming onslaught in the mental health crisis that is going to come after COVID, or is coming because of, on top of our current mental health crisis. We've issues with water. We have issues all across, saying to people who are caring for people in the COVID crisis, saying to them, come work in Ireland, but don't bring your families and you can't stay here permanently. So our strong social foundation is often left also to our charity sector. So I'm really interested to see what else the people here, I'd love you to use the chat and to put in what else you'd add for the social foundation where Ireland is failing right now. Okay. Sorry, just having issues with going forward. Right, our planetary boundaries. And I presume you're all experts at this rather than me, right? Is in terms of Environ 2021, your research elements, what would you put in the planetary boundaries? We are hugely overshooting our boundaries in Ireland. We need to stop greenwashing it, and we just get into action on bringing our boundaries back in and having a reality on how we do that. So again, I'd love to see this. Again, small selection, great campaign recently run about the crap in the Irish waterway systems. We've got to, although it says our blue water isn't in shortfall, we've got to stop using our rivers and our lakes and our seas as a drain for waste. We've got to start respecting them, and we've got to start redressing our biodiversity loss and how we produce food and what we dump into our atmospheres in the ground, and really pull back in and take responsibility for pushing beyond the planetary boundaries in Ireland and in the EU. In Iden, we strongly believe that Ireland's COVID recovery is Ireland's climate pivot. We bridge where we are now with Doughnut economics as a really strong model and framework for transformative action. We can use the Doughnut. And in fact, this session with Kate is a call for Ireland to start using the Doughnut, not just the selfie, not just changing the goal, but to see the big picture, to nurture human nature, to recognize us as a social adaptable society, to use dynamic complexity, be distributive by design, regenerative by design, and be growth agnostic. Our lives have changed and we need to adapt. Ireland needs people, you, me, we need to be making a just space for humanity and nature to thrive with the Doughnut economics as the framework. So for policy, in research, in the places we live, work, play and learn, to manage transformational changes in the economy and with social justice at the core. We need to co-design with people and wild nature. We need to think and act like the 21st century economists. So the Irish Doughnut Economic Network is here. We'd love you to join us, and we will support people to get into action at whatever level they are at. And let's do this. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Kate now. Thanks.
Fantastic, Roisin, that was amazing. If you could let me share my screen, and then I'm going to bring on some more slides. So I'm going to now take this down to the city of Cork. Now, let me be straight up. I've never been to Cork. So what I'm going to share is what I, as a total outsider, can gather and understand in this era of lockdown about your city. And it's just me bringing some questions. I'm bringing these questions to a city because most of the work that we've done downscaling the Doughnut has been at the level of a city. And so I'm applying it hypothetically, and I'm inviting you to bring real knowledge, real content to what I'm sharing here. So can Cork live within the Doughnut? What would that mean to even ask that question? The national Doughnut that Roisin was sharing was created from an internationally comparable data set. So of course it doesn't really get close to touching the actual realities in a place. We all know there's more deprivation and deeper issues than will show up in a global database. That's why we need to zoom in closer and use locally generated issues and data that tell a really true local story. So if we want to get Cork into the Doughnut, let's unroll the Doughnut. Let's open it up and go into that space and zoom in, because then when we go into between the space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling, we can think about here as in Cork and Cork's relationship to the whole world, and use this space like a canvas for imagining and creating and envisioning the future that you want. So what would it mean to do that? And I invite you, even if you're not in Cork, I've seen some folks from British Columbia on this call, which is wonderful, and from many other places. Think of the city that you know, whether it's in Ireland or beyond, but I'm just going to use Cork as the example today. So a city meets the Doughnut. What would it mean to aim to live in the Doughnut? we invite you to ask this ambitious 21st century question. How can Cork, or your city, become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? If people and places worldwide took on this mindset and this ambition, this would be truly transformative, because we would be living with respect and awareness of our impact on people everywhere. So it dives into what we call the four lenses of the portrait. The first one is, how could all the people of Cork thrive? All the people in their full diversity. How can Cork be as generous as the wildland next door? I'm going to come back and tell you more about what this means. These are the local aspirations, thriving people here and a thriving local ecosystem, but they have to be set in the context of global responsibility. So how could Cork respect the health of the whole planet through its relations with all the global supply chains that supply the materials to the city? And also thinking of those global supply chains, how can Cork respect the well-being of people worldwide? So I'm going to dive into these four lenses, because this is what it means to enter the question of the city aiming to live in the Doughnut. Let's start with, how can all the people of Cork thrive? So along the bottom there, you've got those social indicators of the social foundation. You could say, what would be the metrics of whether or not people had decent food, good water, decent healthcare, good quality education, good housing, access to clean energy, good connectivity, mobility? What does this mean in Cork? What does that thriving aspiration actually mean? It's going to be different in your city than in Dar es Salaam, than in Stockholm, than in Mumbai. So the people of a place determine what thriving means here, and the standards that we believe everybody must achieve. What has COVID-19 made visible? Of course, worldwide, it's made things visible that were already there, but that we didn't see, and have become visible. And now we can act upon more intently, because it shows who is falling below the social foundation. How can everybody's needs be met across race and gender, class, geography, religion, culture? How do we ensure that everybody's voice is heard? So how can all the people thrive? Now, how can Cork be as generous as the wildland next door? If I were in Cork with you, and I'd love to be in Cork with you, and I said, take me to the wildland next door, I don't know where you take me. Where is the wildland, the nature, ecosystem as it's been? Nature working as she works, because nature, of course, has a genius of place and figures out how to thrive in different places, knows in a particular location how to cleanse the air and house biodiversity, stores carbon and cycles water, harvests energy, regulates the temperature from the treetops to the forest floor, builds and protects soil. And what would it mean for the city to aim to be as generous as the wildland next door, for the city to store as much carbon and cleanse the air just like the forest does, for the city to welcome and house biodiversity just like the lands around do, and for Cork to harvest solar energy, whether through solar panels or an urban rooftop farm? How can the city belong in the ecosystem of which it is a part? Now let's move to respecting the health of the whole planet, and think of the global supply chains that we are all connected to, the food we buy, the clothes we buy, consumer goods, construction materials, electronics. And let's start by recognizing again that Ireland, like all high income countries, is in very significant ecological overshoot. So you can bet that Cork is in overshoot too. And that means this is a very strong imperative and a responsibility of the nations that have traditionally been the heavy consumers and intense users of Earth's resources to come back within those planetary boundaries. How? How can Cork transform its mobility? I've seen online, people say you've got worse traffic jams than Hong Kong. You don't want that anyway. How can you transform mobility so that actually reduces pressure on these planetary boundaries? How can you transform construction? Could it become circular, as in Amsterdam? How do you transform food? How do you use the systems that are essential to life to come back within planetary boundaries? And then thinking still of people in those global supply chains. Think of the way that your city is connected to people worldwide. So which multinational corporations are headquartered in your city? And what are the business models that they produce and replicate, and the supply chains that they're connected to? Because the prosperity of your city is coming from business models that are connected to the work of people worldwide. And are the rights of those people respected? What brands and retailers are selling products in your city? Every weekend, people are shopping. What are they buying? And therefore, which supply chains are they connected to worldwide? Because we know that the label behind the label does not look so good as the brand on the box. How can we ensure that the companies doing business in our cities and the city institutions themselves are respecting the rights of people through global supply chains, through social procurement. Many cities, by the way, say, oh, no, this goes beyond our scope. You know, that's what almost every city would have said 15 years ago if you asked them about climate change. This is coming, and this responsibility is already there. We're only just waking up to realize there are things that we can do. There is information available, and therefore we can act to respect the rights of people worldwide. So let me pull out, there's the canvas, the 4 lenses, and then we invite you to put whatever issues are critical in your city onto this canvas and use it to solve them in a holistic way. If I put mobility here, how could you recognize what targets does the city already have around mobility? What are you already trying to do? What action is already in motion? Let's celebrate what's already working. What are the key challenges that remain? What new initiatives could be started? And of course, how is everything interconnected? This is the goal of the portrait process. It enables you to see how everything is interconnected. We've run workshops like these in Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam. You can see that this was pre-COVID. This was in late 2019. And what the policymakers and community members in these workshops said was, it's such a relief to think holistically. I work on sewage or racism or transport or education or housing or health or inequality or social welfare. I can see myself in this canvas. There's my issue. And now I can see everybody else, and I can think about how we all connect. So that was a power coming out of what they did. Let me also tell you about a couple of places and how they've actually adopted this. So Amsterdam was the first city to publish its Doughnut report in April 2020. Underneath, you can see a snapshot of what their city portrait looks like. You can see that red overshoot for the city of Amsterdam. They used it in meetings, planning, particularly with respect to their circular economy. So that was their entry point into using the Doughnut. They created an orange donut, of course, for Amsterdam, and a new vision of being a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all while respecting the planetary boundaries. That is a high vision, but it needs to be backed up, not just with a mirror of the portrait and that mission and vision. It needs to be backed up by mobilizing stakeholders and policymakers, mapping what's already happening, changing the mindset from endless growth to thriving, building momentum for transformation, monitoring what's happening. And it has to be playful and fun and irresistible. So Amsterdam have used the Doughnut. You can see it there at the top of their diagram as a core concept driving their circular strategy, to be 100% circular by 2050, to be 50% circular by 2030, 10% circular procurement next year. That is powerful. It's a long, loud legal message to business. You're welcome to do business in our city. If you want to stick around, you've got to get circular. They've also used a new monitor for monitoring the data. Are we becoming circular? So you've got to monitor those new dynamics if we're going to bring them about. Amsterdam launched in April 2020, the height of the COVID infection rate in their city. They said, we want a new direction for where we're going. We quickly published the methodology that we use to create their city portrait, because everything that we create at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is open and in the commons for adaptation. And many cities and places started using this tool within months. So just a couple of examples. Also, Amsterdam residents and community members and startups and university formed the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition, which is a complementary, very much like IDEN, running alongside what the government are doing. And of course, with the city leading it and the community meeting them, there's a momentum and a power going on there. They inspired so many others, including IDEN, to set up. And now these teams are self-organizing and working together, as Roisin illustrated, supporting each other in how they're working and being effective. So Brussels, the Secretary of State for Economic Transition, said, I want to bring the Doughnut here. A local organization then created a beautiful downscaling of the Doughnut in many ways. And I love this visualization of the 4 lenses of the Brussels region. Cornwall decided to use the Doughnut to create a decision-making wheel, that any infrastructural project going through the council decision-making has to be checked against this, like a heuristic tool. And in Melbourne, they've gone through a big process with 40 organizations, 600 people involved, of what does it mean to thrive in Melbourne? So doing that ground up question of what does thriving look like here? I'm going to finish now and just say there's so many amazing people bringing creativity and playfulness to Doughnut Economics Action Lab. That's why we exist, to share back the ideas that people are putting into practice, to create tools that can be used by change makers everywhere. Here are some of the tools and some of the stories. And if you're interested particularly in downscaling, and what we've been talking about today, go to this tool on our platform. It's where we'll upload all the future tools that we're creating so that anybody can take them and use them. I'm going to stop there and really look forward to the conversations and questions that people bring. Thanks so much.
So thanks very much to both Kate and to Roisin. There's already a very lively debate going on in the chat with plenty of local examples of what constitutes the hole in the donut in the Irish case. I should say, if people have questions directly for our speakers, if they would use the question and answer function, and we'll pose those questions directly to our panelists. Kate has to leave at 5 to 6 because she has a prior engagement. So I'll start with the first question from Dan Boyle. Where would the concept of retro first fit in with donut economics, to use existing building rather than to tear down and build anew?
Should I jump in there? Absolutely, bang on. So the circular economy is about reusing, repurposing, retrofitting. In fact, the idea of circularity came from Walter Stachel, who noticed that when you retrofit a building, instead of knock it down and build a new one, not only do you save energy, but you create jobs for people who do that retrofitting, do that insulation, do that refurbishing. So actually, the circular economy concept came out of recognizing that retrofitting creates local jobs and reduces material use. It's a win-win.
Okay, so Justin Tui, in a related question, says the characteristics of our urban centres is that planning is developer-led. Therefore, we have an abundance of selfies. How have you managed, Kate, to influence policymakers in other cities that have embraced donut economics, for example, Amsterdam?
So our first rule at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is that we never knock on a shut door. Partly because I was writing the book when I was a mother of tiny children, and when it came out, I had just no energy to knock on shut doors. And why would you? So we only go where the energy is, which means that every city that we've worked with has approached us. I'm saying that only to say that I have no experience and no advice on how to try and persuade and go to, because I've never done that. What we found is there is so much energy in places that already want to move, that may see the donut and say, that looks like a useful tool for bringing about the transformations we already knew we wanted to make happen. And so they connect with us. And if another framework seems useful, go ahead, use that one instead. I see the SDGs behind you. If the SDG framework is more useful in a place, fantastic, use that one instead. What we found is that, I've come to realize there are change makers everywhere in political situations, often stuck, often feeling trapped by elections and the pressing power of coalitions, but they want to make change happen. And some of them pick up the donut and say, we're just going to stick our neck out here and actually go for this. I've seen that happening in Amsterdam, in Brussels, and many other places. So we work with them and support them and highlight their story, because I can stand on a stage or go on a podcast and say, wouldn't it be cool to use the donut as a tool in the city? But that's not a patch on a mayor standing up and saying, we are using the donut as a tool in our city. That is peer-to-peer inspiration that triggers so many others to choose to act. So we focus on exemplifying those who are in action, because they inspire many others.
Thank you. I think I'll pose this one to you, Roisin. It's Ali Sheridan. Such an inspiring vision for Ireland. What region or project has been the most successful at identifying and using donut economic metrics?
So Ali, that's a great question, and great to see you here as well. So I think it's very early days for Ireland. We have been in conversation, so I don't have an answer, but my invitation is to you and everybody else on the call that we answer that and we get active around it. Let's bring this conversation, let's put the donut in, and let's find ways to answer that and build the metrics and make it happen.
Can I add one thing, Joe, before we go on, which is, to my knowledge, Ireland is the only nation whose president has come out time and time again and said, let's do the donut. That's knockout. That's phenomenal. The other guys of his age and generation, by the way, are David Attenborough and the Pope. So he's in great company. Those three gentlemen have come out and said, I back the donut. To have your president saying that is a phenomenal asset of a nation to build momentum and go.
Okay, I have a related question from Decky Jordan. So Deal talks about going where the energy is and the 25% revolution. How do we influence vested interests and old thinking in the embedded influencers and decision makers?
Great question. To my mind, the way to deal and address and interact with vested interests and the old thinking is, first of all, to build that critical mass of new thinking. So as somebody who always used to be involved in conversations about what's wrong with economics, the last thing you want to do is walk into a mainstream room of economics, somebody's presented the mainstream economics, and then you critique it. I'm so past critique, it's right, and that's not the space we want to be in. A much more powerful place is to be propositional. And I think it's sometimes proposition is the best form of protest. I have a proposition of something new. We have a new value, a new goal. Here's some new diagrams. Here is a new vision. And now we invite the incumbents, we invite the vested interests into this space. And so we are gradually going to be opening up to business. Let me talk about business. We've got a very strict policy actually on companies. Companies and businesses are not publicly allowed to use the Doughnut at the moment because there's a huge risk that it would suddenly just quickly become greenwash. We've all seen that happen. We are going to be opening up and inviting businesses into conversation with us to come and stand on the carpet of Doughnut economics. Come and stand in this space and explain how your business is going to be regenerative by design, how it's distributive by design, and how you're designing your very business itself to ensure that you can do that, that you're owned and financed in a way that enables you to be part of that pivot. So this is our strategy. There are many strategies. It's also important, let me say, that there are people who are publicly out there exposing corruption, locking on to oil rigs that should have been shut down years ago. So I very much stand with people who are in open rebellion. But I think we also need people who are standing for a positive alternative vision and then inviting vested interests to explain how they are going to be transformed. Last thing I'll say, when a disruptive idea meets business as usual, something's going to get transformed. Our job at Deal is to ensure it's not us. We're determined that when we meet business, business is the one that is transformed.
Brilliant.
Yeah, Ger, I just want to build on that as well. I think, we've got to understand that COVID is this humans disrupted moment. We have an opportunity to not just build back better, but to build forward, really to find this as the moment to revolutionize our society for the values we want for Ireland moving forward. Ireland is a young republic, but it's timely now for us to refocus what our values are. And I really strongly believe that Doughnut economics gives us this framework, right? And I think that it's behoven on all of us to stand up and say, actually, GDP just doesn't work. We want something different, and to start talking and opening the conversations around it and bring action to it. I see there's a question there on the PPNs. Ger, can I just jump to that by John McCready? So indeed. What I would say, John, that's a great question. In Ireland, public participation networks provide a platform for civil society groups to engage with local authorities. So how I'd recommend our PPNs would function is to understand what Doughnut economics, what the framework can bring, what the tools can bring, and to use the Doughnut economic models. I see Devon as being a great example for Ireland. They've got a box of donuts. I'm hoping that Jane is going to come and talk to Aiden really soon. But there's also, Melbourne's model is brilliant. Brussels' model is brilliant. It's about understanding what's on offer and how we can bring that into our local place. I live outside. I don't even live in a village. I live outside a village in Wexford, right? I live in that space between a village and another village. So what does it look like for the space that I live in? And what does it look like for the space you live in? If you're part of a PPN, get engaged, join Deal, connect to us in Aiden, and let's open and transform that conversation. That's what I recommend.
Okay, I'm going to throw a political hot potato back to you, I think, Roisin.
Go for it.
Is the Irish Green Party aware of this thinking? Surely they should be pushing this agenda.
That's a really good point. So they are really aware of it. We have several people who are involved in Aiden. We've got mixed parties, not all the parties are represented in Aiden, but the Green Party is aware of it. Why they're not putting it on the central government table as the solution to our COVID recovery, to our circular economy, I don't know yet. I haven't been able to ask Eamon Ryan that question, but he's welcome into that conversation. So this is a call to action for the Green Party also. Get on it. And Cork, our Taoiseach is from Cork. What's going on there? Also, that's a Fianna Fáil call. And don't forget the rest of them either. So it's about all of us bringing that conversation, right? It's not up to anybody, but I do believe we should be following the energy. So if you feel energized from this conversation, go find out more and then start a conversation, just like they're doing in West Cork, just like we're doing across the rest of Ireland.
Great. I think I'll direct the next question to Kate. It's Moira Farrell. How can we mobilise for climate action, starting with the easiest one? Our tree planting has ground to a halt, for example, when David Attenborough only this week says that tree planting is one easy place to start, both with tree farms for wood and for woodlands. So, Kate?
So climate action, as we know, needs to happen across transforming mobility. So we stop using fossil fuels and transform our housing and insulate our homes. I don't know what housing insulation is like in Ireland, but I know in the UK, there's 27 million homes that need insulating. There's plenty of local jobs. So it requires that drawdown of the fossil fuel use, but it also, of course, requires the drawdown of carbon through regenerative planting, some rewilding, through regenerative agriculture, and trees, as we all know, are a phenomenal technology. So I don't know about the situation with tree planting in Ireland, but I would absolutely, thinking through the lenses for portrait, the 4 lenses of the portrait I shared, that's about Ireland becoming as generous as the wildland next door, restore the wildland next door, bring back its generous nature, but also recognize that in restoring your local ecology, you are, of course, sequestering carbon and having an impact on the planetary boundary. So it's a double win. And then, and if you ask, how can that tree planting be of benefit to communities, be job creating? How can it benefit the local community? Then you're beginning to touch upon at least 3 of the lenses in this portrait. That's, again, a value of using the portrait. If you put tree planting at the center, you could make sure you were looking at it in so many holistic ways. You'd come up with a way of designing it that you hadn't seen before, and so many co-benefits of designing it that way.
Okay, the next question is from Kieran Cohan. Now I'm going to summarize because it's quite long. What is the donut economics position on taxation? The hole in the middle of the donut is called revenue, and it's missing because of regressive taxation, global corporate tax evasion, and aggressive tax minimization. So is there a position in relation to the role of taxation within donut economics?
Great question. And actually, it's one of those wonderful questions that's asked so well, you think, I know the person asking this question actually has got a great answer. So taxation is incredibly relevant about how we redistribute the resources generated financially through the current economy that we have. So yes, many people are facing regressive taxes, and we need to see transformations of tax distribution outcomes between households. The question also mentioned corporate tax evasion. I absolutely agree. There's something called the Fair Tax Mark, which invites companies, and Lush is the cosmetics company signed up. Fair Tax Mark says you can sign up to this. It just means you've committed to pay the right amount of tax in the right place at the right time. And as we know, many companies spend an awful lot of money getting advice on how to pay the least amount of tax in as few places as possible, as rarely as possible. So yes, we need to transform corporate tax relations internationally. And of course, that's what the G7 have begun having a conversation about, seeing if they can act on that. But I also want to say, I believe taxes should move from taxing companies for hiring people. We tax companies for employing people, and actually should shift to taxing companies for using new materials. If we want to create circularity, it's a really smart place to tax the use of new materials. That, of course, immediately drives towards that transformation. So I think tax should be an important conversation. Last thing I'll say is, if we only look at tax, what we do is accept the economy throws up great inequalities, and then we try to redistribute through and taxation. It's always going to be important, but I would like to go a level deeper, and I think we need to look at pre-distribution as well. So who owns the sources of wealth creation? Who owns the land and housing? Look what happened in Vienna, it made all the difference. Who owns the enterprises in our city? Are they multinationals, and the money flying out, the tax never shows up? Or are they owned locally by local people and community? Who owns the utilities? Paris privatized its water in the 80s. It's now brought it back under public control because they realize there's a lot of revenue there that can be used for public purpose. So as well as thinking about tax for redistribution, I like to think about the ownership of assets and the sources of wealth creation for pre-distribution, because I think that goes deeper into making a distributive design of our economies.
Great, and I suppose a question that's close to my own heart here, are there examples of downscaling the donut to institutions such as universities?
Great one. And I have to say, I'm going to have to leave after this question because I'm teaching an online course with Ubiquity University, which is a worldwide course, lovely in the spirit of what we're doing, distributive open learning. I haven't seen any university use it yet, but certainly schools. So what would it mean for our school to aim to live in the donut? Brilliant project to do with the kids, right? Looking at their school through those 4 lenses, it connects to so many subjects. Places like there's a harbour in Norway, in Oslo, that is now using the donut for thinking about that development. Someone mentioned planner-led work. Planners in a certain district can use it and say, what would it look like to design this neighbourhood, this district, or this institution with the donut in mind? So it absolutely, we believe, can be used. There's a neighbourhood in Birmingham in the UK that is using the donut to design for just literally a few streets So we're looking at it at a polycentric multi-scalar concept. And I think there's proof of concept that it's useful in all these places.
That's brilliant, Kate. I'm conscious that you have to move on to another engagement. So just before we move on with more questions, just to thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation in conjunction with Roisin. And as we say, it was the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. And there's very rich material in the chat and in the questions. So we look forward to further engagements, which is
Thank you. Huge pleasure. Brilliant questions. And I have to say, this is the first co-note I've done. And it's really important to me to do co-notes because I think leadership is collective and work is collaborative. And so this is a lovely model for many, many more to come. So thank you so much. And Roisin, keep on with Iden because it's really impressive what's going on. And I know it's inspiring many, many people elsewhere. So I look forward to seeing what happens as a result of this session. Bye.
Thank you very much. And connecting back to the last question, I've just seen in the chat there that Carol Power is talking to colleagues in UCC about setting up a Doughnut economics group in the university. And how do you think universities can best support communities to implement Doughnut economics? So Roisin, would you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I would. I think that the same way we're talking about a city scale, I would talk about that in terms of if a university or a school or a business, I would still approach it as bring people together to understand what Doughnut economics is about, look at the tools across deal, partner with us in Iden if you want, and run a workshop. Put that list of questions up that Kate put up. How can the university partner with wildlife and be as generous as wildlife? How can people in the university, how do you bring the university? I know UCC has done a huge amount of work in terms of sustainability and decarbonising the campus. But this is the push more. So Carol, I'd actually love to have a conversation with you about how to do that for the university. To me, it's participatory design. It's like, this is how you do it. In the old days pre-COVID, we'd get a load of post-it notes, we'd put a list on the wall and we'd get people to show up and interact with the information. You can still do that digitally. There's brilliant digital tools. And it's a case of convening those conversations and those actions. And it's about how you move from talking about it to being in action about it. That's really key. But the Doughnut Economic Action Lab has a lot of tools there, and it's a case of us just getting into action about them. You do need to seed the idea and build the groundswell.
Okay, Stephen. Stephen has a question, and I see we have the illustration, the harvesting of the discussion on the overhead there on the nice. Slide. Stephen asked, what's your stance in involving big business and Doughnut action teams within the community, i.e. with regard to greenwashing, and how can we influence policymakers to put the environment and society before economics?
Yeah, I think that, so I'm going to use Cambridge's, Cambridge Doughnut Economics group had a really interesting experience where somebody wanted to sponsor some of the work, because at some point this work, well, Iden is a voluntary group, at some point you reach that barrier where you do need funding and you do need to support people to get into action around this and pay people for the work around it as well. We can't just keep building our resilience and our charitable and community work on nothing. We do need to have substance behind it. So Cambridge saw that this very large organization wanted to support some of the work that they were doing, and they looked a little closer, and in fact the company was trying to build a huge housing project in the area. So I think big businesses, I'd be a little bit cautious about it, but I would always open a conversation and invite curiosity and to explore it. I think that the Doughnut Economics Action Lab have a very strong policy on it. And, I would always look to what their directive is. And in Ireland, it would be great to see more conversations, but I'm a little bit cautious about big businesses using greenwashing for their ESG, etc.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions. Both Darren Clark and Peter Lucy point to the highly centralized nature of governance in the Irish context and a lot of the action. And again, Bernadette Connolly mentions as well that so far it's been kind of cities and urban areas. Now, I know you mentioned the West Cork Doughnut, but that level of centralization, does that mitigate against Doughnut economics?
I don't think it does. So I think the challenge is for us to find ways to make it work in Ireland, right? So there was another great question on the fact that Ireland has less centralised local authority. And I think so there is some signs that might change. But I think so there's a couple of things within the internal Doughnut that political voice, the quality of our democratic lives is really important, right? And I think that's not as healthy as it could be in Ireland. So for me, getting into action around, and for other people in Iden, getting into action at that level is about us changing the system from the inside also. Now, I know that people might consider that naive, but it doesn't stop me knocking at Wexford County Council's door or being open to conversation with Cork or Louth County Council or Leitrim or Roscommon. So I think the challenge is, how do we transform? And it is about transformative action, right? If we're here now and we're dissatisfied with how Ireland is run as a country, as a society, as to what our values are, who changes that? It doesn't come from the top, it comes from grassroots, and it comes from us being in action. And again, the framework allows us to have a real grassroots, but we also need policymakers, we also need researchers to show up when we need people actively pushing this in terms of, and I don't mean it like pushing it in terms of this is how we imagine our future that we want to step into, and that we're addressing our planetary boundaries and creating a stronger social foundation and not failing people in our society. That's really core and central.
Great, and just on that point, Pat Ledwidge has pointed out, even in over-centralised Ireland, local authorities still have huge power to influence the agenda.
Yeah.
But ask the question, is urban generated housing in rural areas aligned with the Doughnut?
No, I wouldn't. So urban generation in rural areas isn't aligned with the government's own policy. Let's be clear about that. Yeah, I probably am qualified enough to answer that question fully. But so what I see is one of the things going on with Deal at the moment is the fact that they are talking about cities. And because I don't live in a city, I've been really thinking about, well, how is that relevant to the place that I live in and the Ireland that I see, which is the spaces between the urban spaces also. It's our natural resources that we don't own. They're not part of our capital. They are Ireland's own. They're like wild nature, the rivers that I've mentioned, the mountains, etc. I think the point is that, and this is why I think it's important to look at the different models and why. So Wales did some really interesting work, and I talk about their model also. They've had a Welsh Doughnut since 2015. They've also had a Future Generations Act since 2015, and their model also would suit Ireland. The Indigenous model that the Maori have used is also an interesting one, where they've really looked at their own culture and re-envisaged the Doughnut. So that's really interesting. They flipped it and have opened it up a little bit. And it really is a case of, you know, where you are in Ireland, what will that mean for you in your place? And that's really the secret of this, is if you live like in a really rural location and you're interested in Doughnut economics, find other people locally to discuss it with and get into action around it. Talk to your local TD, talk to your local councillors about different ways and in new ways, and bringing this transformative action.
And another question then asked about the role of the EU. Has the EU adopted this in any substantive way?
I'm trying to think. That's a question for Kate. I don't actually know. So I don't see it. I think the fact that Brussels has adopted it is a key element, and at their municipality level it is a key element as well. I don't have the information about that, but I can come back to you on it. Okay,
we have a question from an anonymous attendee. When is the next IDEN meeting, please?
So that's a great question. Actually, we don't know yet, and that's really up to what everybody else decides, because we have been running weekly or monthly conversations. If you join IDEN, there is a Friday conversation that's run through our Slack channel, and the information is there. Now, what I'll do is I'll post, we've set up a Google form, and I'll post that in the Slack. So whoever wants to, we're going to launch a newsletter over the summer so that you can keep in contact with us if you don't want to join the Slack channel. I won't ever set up an IDIN Facebook group, so don't expect that, just to be really clear. So this is an invitation to join IDIN or to keep in contact, whichever you want. So it's a Google form. We have a GDPR set up on the wiki if you want to read that. We will never share your data outside the network, and it will be only used for IDIN. I have a really strict data usage and collection policy personally and with our business. Okay, so if you've any questions, you can find us easily. There's several of the IDIN members across Twitter and other social channels, and we are active. The next meeting isn't publicly available, but I am hoping to have the next meeting to be a presentation from the Devon Doughnut, the next public one. We're meeting this Friday with IDIN, so come join us if you want in the Slack channel, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I'm conscious now as well, Roisin, that you're under some time pressure as well.
Yeah, I'm actually doing the course that Kate is giving, but I'm also working on a climate dialogue session with a group in Leitrim. So I'm meant to be, like, that's 3 places, can't be omnipresent, haven't figured that out yet, even in digital scape.
I should just say to the participants there that are attending that the recording of this will be available, and that the intention of people introducing their ideas, their perspectives, introducing themselves, was that it would form the basis of an ongoing conversation. As we said, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation by any stretch of the imagination. Apologies for not being able to get through all of your questions, but it's been very lively, it's been very inspiring. I want to thank on your behalf, first of all, both of our speakers this evening, both Kate and Roisin, for a really fascinating insight to what could be. I also want to thank Cork City Council again for the sponsorship of the event this evening. And a particular word of thanks, I suppose, has to go to the organisers, to Aoife Corcoran, to Paul Bolger, Gino Dwyer and Sinead Mackin, for making this possible. It's been a very enlightening evening. It has gone very quickly, and we hope to see you again in some other format and in some other context. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, Ger.